Okay, so Mike Nichols, Senior Product Design, working on release. Today we're going to talk about feature flags and a little bit of redesign that we went through. So a little intro, work in the release stage on the progressive delivery group. We are in the midst of doing a team split. We will be splitting to progressive delivery and release management. We are talking about doing that split right now. So we're going through the phase of that, and we talked today about feature flags, which you can see is in the viable maturity level right now. So what is a feature flag? Not everybody knows what it is, so let's pause for a minute and discuss what they are. So a feature flag is used to hide or enable or disable a feature during runtime. The features are hidden or sometimes called toggled off, so they don't appear in the application. This allows many small incremental versions of software to be delivered without constant branching and merging. Feature flags unlock faster, more agile workflows by providing control over the flexibility of deployment to specific environments and or audiences. In addition, it reduces the risk to production in the case where a problem is detected. You can just simply turn the feature off. So some common use cases are targeting a specific environment, targeting a specific audience. A lot of times developers will check in code or merge in code that's not complete. You don't want that shown to front-end users, so you'll just hide it behind a feature flag until it is ready to be shown. Looking at this from more of a user's perspective, there's lots of personas involved here. So an example of a job to be done is, as a release manager, I want to be able to control what features are active within my application so I can increase the agility of my workflow. Some other ones are developers. Developers are often the ones that are creating the feature flags. QA engineers often have to turn on and off features as part of their workflow. Release managers also sometimes would just like to control, again, what features are released or releasing them to a specific customer base. And also support engineers. A lot of times for beta customers or to target specific fixes, you'll want to turn on a feature flag for specific users. Some constraints to consider. So our solution is built on top of Unleash. Unleash is a open source library, essentially. So our solution utilizes their API and is largely built on top of that. And there's a link to the GitHub repo, and there's lots of great documentation there. Another factor to consider here with feature flags, so while this ultimately will be a customer-facing feature, this is something that we practice, that we use very much at GitLab. And currently we are using a solution called Flipper that has presented a number of problems, and there is an ongoing effort and a lot of desire to switch over to our own solution that is based on Unleash. Here's a link to the issue that is outlining that effort making the switch. So where are we at today? So currently, like I mentioned before, we are at the viable level of maturity. We have supported 2 strategies: percent rollout and user ID. We've taken a very MVC approach to this. And unfortunately, that MVC approach has both proved to be a problem and also a potential solution. So a problem is in the sense that we made a few decisions in trying to implement the smallest possible feature. Unfortunately, in doing that, we have introduced some roadblocks and some user problems. So the upside to the MVC approach is we are not so far down the road that we've been able to get some feedback from our internal customers, the engineers that are working on this, and just within GitLab itself. And identify these problems early on in the process when we can do something about it. So out of discussions around the functionality for feature flags, some user feedbacks, and some issues that have been raised, it became evident that the current design was not meeting user expectation. It was causing confusion, and it was probably going to limit our feature enhancements. Some of those key problems are, it was not matching well with the Unleash API, did not support multiple strategies, user IDs, the way we had implemented them, could potentially and quickly become unmanageable, and there was really no on-off switch for the entire feature flag, which is kind of a core feature of feature flags, being able to toggle things on and off easily. So at first we attempted to just make some small incremental changes, see if we could address these. But we began to realize this was going to be an uphill battle, and implementing new features moving forward was going to be a challenge. So we needed a new plan. So we took kind of a three-pronged approach. First, we needed to get a clearer vision. This group that had been together has not been together very long. Both myself and the product managers, we hadn't worked together, so we had yet to have a deep dive kind of clear vision conversation about that. So that was kind of step one. Working with the product manager, took a step back, look at the larger vision, the competitions, and see where we wanted to go. There's a deep dive video with the product manager and myself that's linked there if you're interested in watching that. We also had done very little research in this. We didn't have a great idea of our personas, what our users were looking for out of this, so we needed to correct that. So working with the research team, specifically Lori, she started conducting some user interviews, start helping us flesh out our personas, and really understand what our customers are looking for. But then we started to get the idea that we might need to burn this thing down, the unfortunate, scary, like, we might need to redesign this thing. So we went through an exercise to do that. And we did it in a somewhat un-GitLab way, a somewhat experimental approach of not thinking about making small changes, but instead, let's just see what we need to do to fix this thing. Let's tackle all the feedback, all the problem, all the usability concerns. Let's look at what's upcoming and see if we can include that. And then we use that not as a thing to be built, but to drive a conversation of what now. Now we understand where we want to go. Can we break this down into smaller changes that might actually be accomplishable? So here's a link to the issue where that was documented. So the new direction. So armed with a new vision, some user data, and an idea of what needed to be implemented, product management, engineering, and myself were able to break down the monster redesign issue and organize them into 2 epics. 36 issues were created out of this. They're a mix of foundational usability, but also features to ensure that we continue to add breadth. We've scheduled these out over the next 2 to 3 milestones. And then we have a few that are in the backlog after that. So we kind of broke this down into 2 phases. The first phase is really making the foundational shift, correcting the problems that we need to do. And then phase 2 is really more of the usability and then adding features on top of that. So these 36 issues, while a lot of them had the broad strokes of them defined, they're not fully fleshed out. We need to still worry about the details, the edge cases, and we still need to do the usability testing and validation on those. So some takeaways from this experimental process, right? This proved to be a very efficient way to do it. Tackling 36 individual issues would have taken much longer. But by tackling a lot of these at the same time, we're able to reduce context switching. We could see repeated patterns, and the removal of restrictions aided to the efficiency. Also, tackling upcoming features while simultaneously working about the redesign helped us to add depth without sacrificing breadth. We were initially hesitant to do this big redesign. You never want to step back. And there was a fear that we would lose a lot of time in this, and this ended up not to be the case. By removing the restrictions and thinking about the redesign, we were able to come up with something that actually was pretty close to the original design. We just needed to get to the core root problems, and then it turns out a lot of the design could be salvaged. This has been proving to be a great planning tool now that we have 36 issues and a clear roadmap over the next few milestones, both from an engineering standpoint and a research standpoint. It's been pretty beneficial for engineers to be able to understand what they're building today, but also include what is upcoming, to the point where in issues, we're now including like a future consideration section in the description. So for what you're building today, also know that this is the next thing that's coming up after this. I will say though that this has to be the right situation. This is not the kind of exercise that applies to most of what we do at GitLab. This was kind of the perfect storm where We were early on in an MVC. We had identified some problems that need to be addressed, and we had a pretty good idea of what was upcoming in the future. So this type of mass redesign would not be something I would recommend applying to most of your workday. But if you were in that perfect storm, it has proven to be a very effective exercise. So it does look like I have time. So I'll address two of the key changes that are in the foundational items real quick. So the first one was based around user IDs. User IDs were applied at the feature flag level. It's a key way to to roll out a feature to a specific user set is one of the major use cases of feature flags. Unfortunately, the way we had designed it, it would require a lot of rework. So you would have to define a list potentially. If you had 10 feature flags, you'd have to define that list 10 times. This obviously gets unmanageable in larger organizations. If you have hundreds of feature flags and large user groups, updating and maintaining that across hundreds of feature flags would be just a nightmare. So we introduced the idea of groups. So groups is a new kind of data set. Allows you to define the set of users in an external reusable container, and then you can apply that container to the feature flags. So this has the benefits of avoiding the repetition. It simplifies the user management. You can change the list just one time and it updates all the feature flags. Groups can now be assigned per environment. And also, this is an example of where the redesign helps lay the foundation for two upcoming features. The import, export, and parametric generated lists are now set up pretty easily by this, whereas the previous UI would have been difficult to implement those two things. The other fundamental shift was to switch from, we were defining environments and then adding strategies to them. So flipping that idea upside down and defining strategies and adding environments to them. Again, this aligns much more with the Unleash API. It removed a lot of the headaches that engineering was facing with our current implementation. In a worst case scenario, this results in the exact same number of rules that need to be created, but more likely, in the best case scenario, it will greatly reduce the number of rules required as you can apply multiple environments to a single strategy. It also helps to avoid the confusion of what rule and what environment applies in what situations by allowing you to define multiple environments for a strategy. You kind of avoid the collisions of those environments. I think that's all I had. One quick shout out to the folks that I've mentioned here: Ori, Andrew, Shinya, Jason, Darby, John. This was not the kind of effort that happened by one person. This was a group conversation, and these people were instrumental in that process.
Awesome. So Christy had one question. Are we applying groups feature flags to groups as our same existing groups concept? I think I said that correctly.
So it's worth noting that these users are external to GitLab. So these are not our groups that would apply to your GitLab normal kind of groups. These users live outside of our database. Eventually, we are hoping to build in like an LDAP database kind of integration. But right now, these are users that live completely out of our system, and we really have no insights into that. So I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but it's not the GitLab group. It's an external group.
Yeah, that part I got. But we have a concept of groups already in GitLab, whether it's for internal GitLab users or our broader, wider GitLab community. So my question was around, are we just taking that same group model that already exists and now applying it to feature flags? Or is it that we have a groups concept within the product that exists, and then the groups concept for feature flags is a slightly different concept? And this, by the way, is not me asserting an opinion on either one. I'm just...
It's a separate entity for feature flags. Which I think will become evident why it needs to be that way once we get into the parametric kind of way where you can define. So when I say parametric, that would be a thing like a user that has been around for 30 days, right? That might be a way to define a group, or a user that is met some criteria. Essentially is a way to define groups. So they will inherently be kind of a separate entity, I guess.
Cool. That makes sense. Thanks for answering my question. Something you might think about is just a taxonomy of that, and whether that becomes confusing since it's the same taxonomy. But that is a minor.
Yep, that was one of our top questions from our research issue, was the taxonomy of group, right? Was just it's a name collision, and groups it's a tough one. So we do have that out there. We are doing some research on that.
Awesome. Hey, this was awesome. This is awesome. I was so pleased to see how you took that end state vision and broke that down into those iterative pieces. I want to see us doing more and more of that as much as we possibly can. So fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I also want to point out, Tori shared this in the comments, but like defining that story and then breaking it down, like that is the GitLab way, right? And I think she makes a great point. Like, you know, understanding that journey and then getting to the MVC is in walking it backwards. And, you know, you did a really good job of that, or the team did a really good job of that. So congratulations.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to highlight that, because I think we sometimes feel like at GitLab, let's only do small things, and oftentimes we need to do big things broken down into small things is an important concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.